Hello viewers, this is Cosmic Nick here, and in this video I'm going to be reassembling the DS Lite. So it's going to be a continuation off the last video. This is the same DS Lite, just all in pieces now, but we're going to take this thing and put it back together. I'm going to try to give you guys some tips and tricks about the kind of best way that at least I see to put this thing back together. So yeah, we're going to get to work on that. Alright, so first we're going to be going over the tools that we'll be needing to reassemble this. You can have a tweezers or some kind of small pointed object maybe that can help you kind of push and position certain things back into place. And then you're also going to be needing a Phillips 0 and a Y0 bit. I will have a diagram linked in the description where it'll show all the different screws and the different screw bits that you'll need, and it'll just kind of help you find exactly where each screw needs to go. You can compare the sizes of the screws in case you get them mixed up. And I think the Phillips 0 and Y0, that's the sizes that iFixit has assigned to them. Different manufacturers might label them differently. They should be pretty universal, but just in case, this is what iFixit calls them, as the Y0 and the Phillips 0 for those sizes. All right, now let's move on to the reassembly process. All right, so first things first, we're going to put the screen back in for the DS Lite. It's going to be probably the hardest part of this reassembly process, but at least we can get it out of the way first. All right, so we got the top shell piece right here. Got the screen. You want to be careful with the speakers. You don't want to let them drop off or like hang too much, because then they might snap if they're dangling and flailing around too much. So just be mindful of the speakers. They are fine, just like, just dangle for a little bit, but you don't want to leave them flailing around too much like this and then they end up snapping. Also, the thing about the speakers is there is a little like plastic ring around the edge here that comes up like this. So you want to make sure not to lose that. It won't really like affect anything too much, but I think it's just like a little buffer so that the speakers aren't like rattling against the plastic. So, just keep an eye out. It looks really shimmery. The shimmery side is facing outwards, and it's sticky on the other side. But there's supposed to be a little ring around the speakers that, like I said, is supposed to keep them from vibrating against the plastic. So careful not to lose those, because I've done that a couple times. Alright, so the first kind of tip that I'll be showing you is how to get the screen lenses back on and lined up properly when you put the DS Lite back together, because that can be kind of tricky. You can try to eyeball it, but I've found that it's kind of tricky to do that and end up maybe having to take it off and reapply it a bunch of times, which just risks you messing something up. The more you mess with it, the more chances are of something breaking. So what I like to do is after I give a gentle wipe, if there's any dust on there, which hopefully there's not too much if you needed to take it off, but yeah, give it a gentle wipe and then drop the screen lens into place, and it should fall into place where like everything is lined up like that. If it doesn't, then just like shift it around a little bit and then it should fall into place. And then just drop the screen in like that, and then it should stick to it, and it should be lined up basically perfectly now. It should fit in there pretty well and attach to the adhesive fairly easily. And then after you've done that, you can continue to put the screen back into the shell piece. All right, so what I like to do is just first put the screen roughly into position just so it can like rest on the shell. And then I move it to the side a little bit just so that I can start coiling up the cable. I move it to the side and then I wind up the cable. I coil it up either once or twice. Maybe twice is a good amount, yeah, to get it a little bit tighter. Okay, so I got it coiled up, and now the connector piece, like I can have it wrapped around about twice. The connector is back facing the front part of my finger here, and then I'm just gonna feed it through. And if you want to make it a little bit easier, you could put the piston back into this side before you do that, so you don't have to coil it up again. So it will be a little bit tricky, but as long as you're holding it without too much pressure, because you don't want to damage or bend the ribbon cable, as long as you're holding it in the circle shape, you should be able to feed it through this hole. I'm having a little bit of trouble here. Of course, while I'm on camera, I have trouble doing this. Alright, and then if you, like I said, for the other, when disassembling it too, if you feel resistance, too much resistance, stop. You don't want to put too much pressure on the ribbon cable and then damage the edges of it, because then the screen's not going to work properly. Anyway, so once you get it through that little circle, you just push it gently through and slide the screen while you're doing that. And the piston's coming out with it, but that's okay. And then just pull and then let it unravel once it releases. There we go. All right, now you don't want to set the screen back down all the way yet, because we still have to put the cables back in, the little wireless antenna and then the microphone cable as well. So make sure not to put the screen back down. You'll have to pop it back up. It will be easier than when you originally took it out because you've already removed the screen, but still, you just don't want to have to fight against the adhesive if you don't have to. So sometimes I lift the screen up when doing this part. I mean, I'll probably just do that just so that it's easier for you guys to see. I think usually I just have it facing down, and then I just kind of funnel the cables through while the screen is faced back down this way, but we'll just do it this way so you guys can see. So just put the little black cable in first. Usually what I go for is the black one first. You want it so that these little holes in the antenna or in the chip, whatever it is, will line up with those little pegs here. And then you want to take maybe a small pointed object, you know, whatever, maybe a pry tool or something, and just gently press the cable so that it is fitting into this slot right here. These two little pegs right here. I might get a separate shell so you guys can see. Okay, so I know the black shell is a little bit harder to see because of the color, but yeah, you want to slide the black cable into these little nooks here where these little pegs are. You just want to follow those little pegs, those little notches. So follow that with the cable so that it'll hold it in place. So there we go. Got the cable seated in those little slots. There we go. Now that cable is good to go. Now we're going to put in the microphone. So the thing about the microphone is I didn't realize for quite a while how to wire this into this shell piece properly, because before I was just like popping the microphone into that little slot and putting the wire through, and I thought it was good to go. It's a little bit more to it than that. So just filter it through like normal. And then, you know, you kind of want to put these cables back in like the same way they were before. You see, you kind of want to follow the bend so that it'll everything will fit back nice and properly. So, you know, just try to do that. But anyways, so what I was talking about is after you pop that little microphone in there and sit it in that little circle slot, it's not done yet. You have to do the same thing that you did with the black cable. You have to push it down into these little slots here and follow those slots so that it'll hold it in place properly, because you'll feel some resistance when you try to put the other top part of the shell back on if you don't do this, because this cable will be pushing up against it. So push that down into those little slots and it's good to go. I'll show you guys on the other shell again. There's these little slots that follow along here, this little nook here and this little nook here. You're gonna put the microphone in there and follow those little slots with the cable. It'll just hook in nice and easily here so that it'll be secure. So that's good to go. Now we can put the screen back on. And I know one of my viewers had commented about replacing the top screen and having to solder the speakers on. So I'm gonna make a video about that, hopefully sometime soon. But I know my video schedule has been all over the place still. I thought I would be doing better this year, but I guess I'm not. Anyways, so I will get to that video at some point. So now we can just put the screen back in here. It'll fall back into place pretty easily as long as it's, you know, already has the screen protector lined up. So it should line up pretty easily as long as it's nice and flush. It should be fine. You can put a little bit of pressure if you like to secure it, but don't put too much. And then for the speakers, you can take the same little, you know, pointy pry tool, whatever you have that can be small enough to fit into these small areas. You can just carefully push the cables for the antenna into that little slot here. There's a little slot that where this little peg is, and it'll hold the cables in place just like the other ones are holding the antenna and the microphone in place. So that way that the speaker cables aren't out of place, and then when you put it on, you might crush them, accidentally cut the speaker off of a DS Lite that I was working on one time when I did that. So careful of that. And the other speaker, same thing. As long as it's been put back relatively the same as it was before, it should kind of follow, like the shape of the wires, the way that they're bent should follow this path anyways. So that's kind of also a guide for how you'll know if you're like putting it back together right. Like these cables should fairly easily line up, well, except for this, should fairly easily line up with the notches that they are supposed to be seated into. These cables are very thin, so whenever kind of trying to seat them back in and putting pressure on them, you just want to be careful because they're very thin, easy to break. Anyways, there we go. These cables are seated back in properly, so everything is nice and flush, and it should be fine. Make sure that these little rubber guards here for the screen are in place. They're kind of falling out right now, because those fall out too, so careful not to lose those. So now we got the top piece, And remember, it's a sliding mechanism, so you want to have it not completely lined up with the back. You want to have it offset, but just lay it on here without like actually pushing anything, and then I slide it back this way first until it falls into place. See, now it's flat on the sides here because it's been lined up, and then you just push it. And you want to double check before screwing anything in. Make sure that both sides here are nice and flush. So flush here, flush here. All right, so now that the top part is slid on, we can put the screws back in. It'll just be these 4 Phillips screws. And then when putting screws back in, this is actually something I saw from the retro future. But how I always do my screws now is I screw it backwards in the opposite direction until you hear this little clicking sound. Let me show you with a different screw. All right. I can't get it with these screws, but basically what it is if you turn the screw backwards and you'll wait until it falls basically into place, and that'll make sure that the screw is going back into its original thread that it was designed for, like the original screw thread, and it's not going to be just screwing in at a random point and screwing a new thread into the device. Like, it shouldn't damage it, but if you want to be like extra careful, that's usually how I screw in my screws now. I'll do it the opposite direction until I feel it click, which is basically the screw like falling back into its original thread, and then I start screwing it in the proper direction. Anyways, so there we go, we got the 4 screws back in. All right, so we put the little screw covers back on. Remember, very easy to lose, so you want to be careful. And you want to maybe keep them, like I said in the last video, on something plastic, or maybe you can just throw them onto the screen here itself if you want to keep track of them more easily, because you want to make sure that they're still sticky. I mean, most of the time they're fine and they'll stick back onto here by themselves pretty easily, but sometimes they're better than others, and sometimes the adhesive might come up. Anyways, there we go. So we got the screw covers back on. So now for another tricky part, we got to get the ribbon cable back into this little shell piece. So what I like to do is I like to put the cables through first and then the screen. I think that's probably the easiest way. I don't know if I don't think any other way is probably easier, trying to put the cable in first, or the ribbon cable. So just carefully, get these little antennas through here. I think the easiest way, because if you try to just do it like straight in like this, it'll just push against the shell, and it'll be a little tricky if you just try to go from the left side. So if you want to go from this side here of the ribbon cable first, you want to try to put that side in first. So I'll show you. Just line it up that way. So that way it won't push against this side of the shell here, and you won't have any resistance. But after you get that in, then just make sure to put maybe a little bit of pressure to push the cable through, because it will bunch up and press against this piece here. So there we go. Now that's filtered through, and I'll just take it out real quick and then show you guys again. So I'm going to put this side of the cable in first. So I'll have it at a little angle, and don't want to pull on it too much. Remember, we want to be careful with the ribbon cable. It's very fragile. But put that side in first through the slot, and then just kind of push it down a little bit, and then just follow the slit, and it will come through the other side like that. And then you want to make sure, before sliding it all the way on, make sure that the ribbon cable is all the way through the circle, so that you don't push on it with the plastic like I kind of just did. But there we go. That's how you get that part in. And then to put the hinge in, the way I do it, in case it falls out like this, you want to have the silver piece on here, and then the way I check it to make sure that it's in the right position is you should be able to turn it and click it twice. So how I do it is I usually it should be fine to just put it in like this, honestly, as long as it fits through and goes in. Let's see. Like that, it should be fine. But sometimes if I want to like double check that it's faced the right way, I just have it facing me like this, and then I turn it. It might take a little bit of pressure. Turn it. You hear one click, and then another click. So that's how you know that you were starting in the right position. So now you got to turn it back the other way. So go, what would that be? I turn it this way until I hear 2 clicks, and I turn it back the other direction to make sure I'm starting in the right position. But as long as you have it notched in here like this, in this little piece, and it slides in like that without any issue, and it lines up, it should be fine. And you can always test it carefully before putting too much pressure on it before you screw anything back in. All right, so we're going to take the long silver Phillips screws now, and these are the only silver Phillips screws that are a different size. The rest of the silver Phillips are the same size. These 2 are the only ones that are different. And if you're taking apart 2 different DS Lites and swapping parts or something, sometimes, or some DS Lites, these silver screws here are slightly shorter. These ones are the long versions, but there are certain DS Lites, and I've seen them quite a few times, where these silver screws here are a little bit shorter. So you want to make sure you have the right screws for the right DS, because I tried screwing in this extra long version of this screw into this hinge piece here, and I ended up breaking this little plastic piece right here, the little notch piece that holds the hinge. So yeah, if you have two different DS Lites and you just have the screws, you want to be careful, because these two long screws on different DS Lites, they are different lengths. These ones are the long versions, and some DS Lites have shorter versions of these screws. So you just want to be careful of that. But all right, so we got the buttons back in. The D-pad is easy enough. Put that back. Oh, that's the wrong membrane. All right, smaller membrane is for the D-pad. And then these buttons, they're kind of tricky, not like super tricky. I usually like to look at them and see if the letter is facing the right way first. And then I'm like, oh, okay, so which notch here, because the buttons are specific for each of these slots here. So usually I just like check to see, oh, is the button the right way up with the letter facing me? It's like it is. The Y is in the right direction. Might need to turn off the flashlight for this. Okay, so the button has the letter facing the right direction. It's facing, you know, upwards and proper. And I just look to see which slot it goes into. It's got this little nook here, so it'll fit here into that slot, because no other circle here has this notch matching up, so you know that this one goes here. And you're just going to kind of follow that same process for the rest of these buttons. The letters facing the right direction, turn it around. Now which circle has this nook here? Will be this one, so it'll go in there. You can just trial and error it too, but you know, this will save you a little bit of time. It's just a way to make it a little bit easier. There we go. Buttons are back in, and we got the start and select buttons as well, really tiny ones. Be careful not to lose those. Actually, all these buttons are really easy to lose, but speaking of, I cannot find the start button now. All right, so I was able to find it. It was just behind another part of the table a little bit. So yeah, that's just a warning that I'll probably have to splice in. Just it could be helpful to have containers for all the small pieces that are, you know, a part of this, especially handhelds, very small pieces, small screws. So that's always useful to have any containers to separate them, or just to hold them in general. Anyways, so we got the two buttons back in, start and select, interchangeable. Put that little membrane back on. And this is just a random warning too, but when doing screws, I try not to do them too tight. I just try to do it so that, okay, so you hear that little drop sound right there when the screw is turning in the opposite direction. See, like, you hear it for this one. That little sound right there. If you feel that and you feel that little click, that's when you stop, and then you can turn it the other way. So that's what I was talking about when putting the screws back in. But yeah, I try not to tie the screws too tight, just, you know, securely enough. And then just another warning, I guess, for screws in general is, like, if you're turning it and you feel a lot of tension, you know, maybe stop, unscrew the screw, and then see if it's going in properly. You don't want to be putting it in at an angle and then something breaks. Yeah, so just be careful with that as well. All right, so next we're going to lay down this little white cable for the antenna. So it's going to wrap around here, kind of like that, around the two little circles here and here. So I'm going to push it down. I try to give it a little bit of tension so that it'll have some length on it and kind of go back in the way it's supposed to. Okay, so this is how the cable is supposed to be wired through here. I didn't know how to do that a couple times for the first couple DSs that I worked on, and yeah, it just was causing issues with the board, the motherboard, once you try to put it back in, not sitting properly. So I try to pull on it, a little bit of tension, and then you wire the cable through here, and then you can push it down into these little slots here and here, and then one more right here. And then that'll hold the cable in place. And it might come up from like this slot here usually when trying to put the motherboard back in, but that's okay. It's not too hard to push back down. All right, so we're gonna be putting this to the side for now. And we're gonna have to put the bottom screen back on to the motherboard now. And then, like with the top screen earlier, you can put the touch screen into the bottom shell piece like this. And, you know, after you get the dust off of it, or you can put it in there first and then try to pat away any of the dust. But after it's lined up, which this one isn't, there we go. Just want to be careful and avoid touching the screens and the lenses, because you don't want to smudge it up and just be really difficult to clean. But once that's lined up, you can just drop the screen into place, or just put it into place, get a little bit of pressure so that it sticks to the adhesive. Then your screen will be lined up with the touchscreen just fine, and it should be aligned so that the borders and everything are aligned properly. Yeah, I've just found it easier to do it that way instead of trying to like stick it back on and like eyeball it, because you just never know if it's going to be aligned properly until you put it in, assemble the whole thing, and sometimes it doesn't put back together properly, and the screen won't like fit in here very well if you don't have it lined up just right. And then once you turn it on, you might realize that like the borders where there's the black line like around the screen isn't there properly, and it'll just be like really annoying because it's not centered and everything. So I found this is the easiest way to put the screen lenses or the touch screen back onto the screens themselves. Just the easiest way that I've found and the most accurate. So I like to put the bigger ribbon cable in first, the actual cable for the screen. You just want to slide it in, and then usually I push on it from the back with my finger here. You're not going to really be able to see it on camera, but once it's lined up, just give it a little push on each side, and then the cable should look like this. It should be pretty flush against it, and these little square notches on the side should be fairly close to the connector, and they should be even on each side to make sure that both sides are going in the right way. So as long as that's fitted in there securely, you will be good to go to just close down this little tab, and you should be fine to just use your hand, just be a little careful. But yeah, and then that's what it'll look like once it is done. Just fit in there securely, and you don't want to push on it too hard when forcing it in, so just be careful. But yeah, and then we'll turn it over and be careful not to let go of the screen because it will flop and dangle, and you don't want to rip the ribbon cable. So just, you know, keep your hand on the bottom screen while you're doing that and just hold it. All right, so then make sure that the tab for the touchscreen is up so that you can put the connector back in. Now this one you want to be really careful with. It's very tiny ribbon cable, as you can see, and it's very easy to break. So you can use tweezers if you want, just be careful because sometimes tweezers are a little pointy and they could poke it as well. I usually use my hand, but I'm also used to doing this and working with this console and the various fine components that go with it. I've done it many times. But if you want to use tweezers or your fingers, just do whatever is most comfortable for you. So it's really easy to think that this cable is pushed in when it's not. So it really just takes a little bit of practice and gauging it with your eyes. You just gotta make sure it's lined up, and you can see it's very tricky. If it does give you a little bit of trouble, what you can do is bend the connector just a little bit. You don't want to cause damage to it, but you can like bend it so that it's a little bit rounder for you to put in. So like right now, I'm gonna make it kind of follow the bend of my finger by pushing on it and making it kind of shape it a little bit. That way the connector will be in a better shape, like it'll be more round, so that when it's pushing in, it's not missing the slot as easily. So you can do it. So see now I have reshaped the connector a little bit, so now it's a little bit more round. But anyways, so that's something you can do like if you are just struggling with it and you really can't get it in. That's what I've done a couple of times, is just put a little bit of pressure and, like I said, very carefully bend the cable so that it's a little bit more round, and this way it'll be easier for you to pinch and grab onto, and you can line it up and just fit it into the slot. All right, and once it's in there, just make sure to keep your hand on the whole time on the bottom screen so it's not falling. So yeah, you want to keep your finger maybe on the ribbon cable for the touchscreen to make sure that it doesn't keep sliding out like it has been for me, and then close the door. A little flap there. And there we go. This one, yeah, it's not as easy to tell as the bigger ribbon cables that it's in there. So, you know, if you want to, you can just like maybe give it a slight wiggle and check and be like, okay, that is actually in there. So you can double check on the sides too to look, and you can see, you know, whenever you're working on it yourself to make sure that that cable is actually in there. Because sometimes it'll look like it's in there and it's not, and then it just, yeah, will be a whole mess. But once it's in there, you know, put a little bit of pressure on it and then close the door, a little flap that's there, and then it should be locked in. That's good to go. So now we're going to put this board back into the shell. So I usually have it like this when putting this cable back in for the top screen. Make sure the door is up so that you can put the ribbon cable back in. And I usually use my thumb to push the cable out a little bit, so like that's what it's at naturally, I use my thumb to kind of like stretch it just a little bit. It has a little bit of wiggle room because of the length. So I use my thumb to kind of push it out a little bit and then just line it up. And then I usually get one side in first, or like one side is usually in more first just from doing this. And I just kind of push both sides in carefully and make sure not to bend the cable, you know, at all. You don't want to break it. Just slide it in and just, yeah, keep your hands kind of supporting it so that nothing is falling back out. And then once both sides are in, there's a decent amount of tension, so you can just, you know, release your thumb and then close the tab. But make sure to keep everything close together so that nothing is pulling and the cable is not getting pulled back out. But then that's what it should look like once it is back in there properly. Same thing with the bottom screen. The notches on the side of the ribbon cable should be lined up evenly on each side and should be fairly close as possible without breaking or bending the cable. Then closing the tab, and that should be good. So now that that top screen is reattached, just gonna put this back down. And before doing that, you wanna make sure that the black ribbon cable is actually behind the DS Lite motherboard, like that. So yeah, the ribbon cable is gonna be behind the antennas here, so that these cables are in front. But then you want to make sure that the black cable is just behind the motherboard, but the white cable is going to be under it. So there we go. So now the black cable is popping back through the top like this. Okay, so this next part can be a little bit tricky because, or not like super tricky, but it can be a little bit frustrating because this white antenna, like I said, sometimes pops up from the little notches here. So you want to be careful, but you're just going to slide the motherboard back onto these two little circle pieces here. One here and one here, because that's what's going to hold it into place. But you want to make sure that the white cable on this end is above that circle and above the board. So just want to line it back up. And I usually have the white cable under the touchscreen ribbon cable as well. I think that's how it is when you originally take it apart, but it doesn't really matter if it's over it or under it, but I usually try to leave it how it came out when it was manufactured. Okay. So this is fighting with me a little bit. Another way I kind of like to do it is, yeah, I like to prop it open like this, and then I can kind of put pressure on the bottom too and kind of like move it around from side to side until it's in place. So you can do it that way as well. You can just lay it down while it's on the table, whatever you prefer. But there we go. So now it's seating in here properly. Got these 4 circles, or I guess 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 5 circles that are holding the board in place. Those are where the screws are going to go later. And like I said, the white cable, you just got to be careful, make sure it doesn't pop up from its slots. But if it does, it's okay. You can just lay the board back down, try to push the cable back into those slots, and try it again. So actually I can show you how to do that. So yeah, in case that does happen, let's say this cable, you know, when I was working on it, you see it's already coming up from this slot here. So just lay the board down carefully and just make sure to not stretch it out at an angle or anything. Just keep it lined up so that there's not too much tension on the ribbon cable for the top screen. Yeah, and then just try it again. And then I usually just try to lift that to make sure. And then there we go. Yeah, try to lift that to make sure that this white cable is coming over the motherboard and not getting squished under it. There we go. So like I was saying, I like having the white cable under the ribbon cable for the screen. I think that's how it is when you originally take it apart, or a ribbon cable for the touch screen. It's not too big of a deal if it's on top. Sometimes I do it either way. Okay, so these little antennas, you want to be careful when putting them back in, just because they are really easy to break the tops off. Like I said, they're very fragile, very small cables. Easiest way to also make sure that nothing's going to start flying out at you is to screw down the motherboard first. So the 2 screws you can put in are the silver small screws. You can put one here, I'll hold down the board, and then you can put the second one right here, and this one can actually be taken out while this piece is on. You can see there's a little hole there that's big enough to unscrew it. So you can put those 2 screws down right now, and that'll hold the board in place on each side, so that's good. And then you can start messing with everything else, and it'll be much safer. You know, you don't have to worry about anything flying out for the most part at this point. So yeah, these little antennas, like I was saying, they can be kind of fragile, so you want to make sure it's lined up onto the circle first, and you'll kind of have to get a feel for it. But once you feel like it's lined up, and then you can just put a little bit of pressure on it, and then there you go. It's really easy to miss these, like it'll feel like it's in place when it's really not. But yeah, you'll just have to be careful and patient when putting that in. As long as you don't put too much pressure on it when forcing it down, even if it is offset and it's not lined up right. If you're not putting too much pressure, it should be fine. You just gotta make sure when it's lined up, and then just push it and you'll feel a little click, and then that's how you know it's in place. And then this cable actually, being shaped like this with a slight bend is actually, I think, how it's supposed to be. It's kind of perfect to line it up like that so that it's not like just hanging out this way or in the wrong spot. So usually, yeah, like once that's in place, you know, you can maybe pull on it a little bit if it's straightened out, just so that it's reshaped like this again. I think that's how it originally comes. Okay, now this part can be a little bit tricky, putting this black antenna back in. So we're gonna do the same thing as we did when we pulled it out. We wanna straighten it a little bit. Don't put too much pressure on it though, because you don't wanna snap the top off. Like I said, these antennas, very fragile. So just gonna straighten it out a little bit. Doesn't need to be like super duper straight, but and it really helps to have it straight near the end here of the cable. So like bending maybe the cable a little bit so that it's straightened out. That one usually helps better than like just the entirety of the cable being straight. So here, and then just gonna slot it through right about here. And then as long as it's straight, it should go through fairly easily. If it doesn't, you know, you can try to wiggle it back out and maybe straighten it out again, but it should go through fairly easily and then pop out the other side like that. And since this little thing is blocking it, I'm just going to use some tweezers to pull it to the side gently and grab on the cable, not the connector. And there we go. So now that's filtered back through. So you can see that's the side that it's going in on, is just right there next to the little solder blob for the cartridge reader. But yeah, as long as you're putting it anywhere like in this general area right here, it should be fine to flow through there pretty easily. So I usually put the chip back on next. So just have this little chip here, make sure you know you got the connector right direction on this side, and there we go. And then I usually push down on the cable here because it's supposed to slide through this between this circle here and this little piece here. It's supposed to lay down in between there, so I usually just like push and hold down on it just gently with my thumb or my nail, and then while doing that I pull on it carefully and then bend it so that it's facing and can connect here. And then after that, after it's connected, you feel the little click. I just pull on the cable carefully, not the connector, don't want to break it. Just pull on the cable a little bit and then push down on this side while doing that. And that'll make sure that it lays as flat on the board as possible. Because what you're going to see now is you might have some trouble if you don't have it flattened out like that. When putting this trigger back on, that black cable will actually push on the trigger. And then, you know, that's just what I've noticed over time when working on this. So you see now it's completely fine. The trigger is not having any kind of weird tension on it and it's pressing properly. So that's just what I usually do to try to make sure that it's as close to how it was out of the factory as possible, and it'll make it easier when putting it back together. You're not going to have weird pressure from that cable pushing against that trigger. So there we go. Now that that's all back together, I'm going to show you guys how I put together these triggers too, if they do happen to come apart. So I'm just going to show you really quick. Very easy to lose these pieces. The antenna's very small, very tiny. So to make sure you have the right spring, because these springs are actually specific for which trigger you're putting them in. So the springs is kind of hard to see, but one side that has these little notches is actually higher than the other side. Okay, it's a little hard to see, but all right, there we go. So it's really hard to tell on camera. I'm trying to show it, but this side right here, this pin, is lower than this side. You'll be able to see it when you have it in your hand, you know, so you'll be able to tell. It's kind of hard on camera, but this pin on the left is lower than this pin on the right for the spring. And so the reason I say that is because you want to make sure that the lower side is facing outward. It'll be facing this way, because that's going to be the piece that hooks into the little notch here. So you want to make sure the lower side, when putting it into the trigger, is facing outwards. So you want the higher side inside the trigger and the lower side outside of the trigger. And that's how you'll know that you have the right spring, because you see, if I try to put it this way, put this spring and put it into this trigger, now the higher side is on top instead of the bottom. So you don't want that, because it's gonna be too high up and it's not going to sit into the little notch here properly. So you want to make sure the lower side is facing outside of the trigger. All right, so when putting this back together, in case you need to, just, hold on to the lower side, which should be facing out, and just try to line it up so that the circle here is lined up with the circle here. And I kind of have my finger in the back bracing it so that when I lay it down, it'll hold it in place. And I just kind of pinch it with my finger that's bracing it and my thumb, and then try to carefully put the piston back in. And then hopefully, if you're able to hold it all in place, then you'll be able to slide the piston in and line it up. It's very easy to drop that, so make sure you're over a table or you have a very clean area so that you can find it. All right, so here we go. We're gonna do it with the other trigger now. Same thing, have the lower side of the spring facing outside of the trigger and have the higher side of the spring inside of the trigger. Then use the finger in the back to brace it so that it doesn't fall out, because the spring is very easy to fall out. And pinch it with your thumb once you have it lined up. So pinching it with the thumb and the finger in the back to brace the spring so it doesn't fall out, and it'll kind of hold it in place for you while you put that piston in, and you can kind of wiggle it, and there we go. Now it's through there and through the spring. And when doing this, you're probably going to push and then the spring will fall out, or you'll push and then you think it's in the spring, but then the spring comes out because it's not through. So yeah, it'll take some practice, but that's kind of the best way that I've been able to do it, is to just put the spring in first, make sure it's the right spring, right direction, and then just kind of pinch it in place so that it'll hold the spring still, and then you can put the piston in. And then when picking the triggers back up so that you can put them in, you want to kind of do the same thing. You kind of want to brace it with your finger, and put a little bit of pressure on it so that it'll hold the pieces in together, and so they won't slide back out and fall out and you have to put it back together again. So yeah, just kind of brace it with your hand so that it's lined up, and then just put the spring, the little pin from the spring, into that slot here, and then make sure the piston is lined up, and then there you go. Now that's lined up. So let me show you. There you go. You got the little pin from the spring, the lower part, like I was saying, that should be facing outwards, and have that little part of the spring in that little slot here, and the piston goes into the slot. Like on this side, the piston will go into that little circle here, and then the spring will go into that little nook here. So then what's also probably going to happen when you're putting this in is, if you're putting the trigger in and then this happens, and now you see the spring piece is to the side like that, and it's not in that little nook anymore like it should be. What you can do is, if you have something small, like I have this little flathead that I use a lot for a lot of different reasons and purposes, but it's really good and helpful. Something small that you can use, you can just hold the trigger down, and then you can push on the spring until it's back into that little slot, and then push it down a little bit, so that way it'll be held in there nice and securely. You can just put a little bit of force on the spring to push it down a little bit, and then it'll be back in place, because that will probably happen. It's just, it happens when trying to put this back together, and then the little spring will fly out of its little slot here. But yeah, if you want to make sure it's put back in there properly, if you don't want to take the whole thing back out and try again, then you can just hold it down and then push the spring back into place with something small. If you want to just do it this way and you don't want to use something small and try to push the spring, just make sure the little piston goes into that little circle here, and then make sure the spring is in that little slot, and then you can just turn it until the trigger is lined up, and then boom, you can push down the piston to make sure it's in place, and then push down on the spring pin a little bit to make sure it's also nice and secure in its little slot. There you go. So now we got the trigger back in place on this side. Little spring pin is in there, and then this side we have the same thing. Got the spring and the trigger lined up, and the piston all pushed down and secure. And then you can just hold it down, try to make sure that the spring doesn't come back up. You can test out the trigger to make sure it feels good. It's nice and clicky, so that's perfect. Same thing with the other side. You just push down to make sure nothing flies up while you're doing this. And the trigger is nice and clicky. That way you'll be able to double check that the triggers are lined up properly before you put it back together all the way, and then try to click on it and it doesn't feel good. All right, so we're gonna put this to the side for now, and we are going to reassemble the bottom piece. So you can take out, like I showed in the last video, you can take out the stylus holder. How did Retro Future say it? It was kind of funny. He said the stylus sheath. You take out the little stylus sheath and clean it out, because that's usually the dirtiest part. And you can see on this bottom shell, it's usually where it gets fairly dirty too. But yeah, so you can take these pieces out, and the little metal shield that goes here for the GBA slot, and just allow you to clean it up a little bit more. So I forget this a lot, but some of these DS Lites, not all of them, have this little white piece that goes under the stylus sheath. So it's gonna go under the stylus sheath, and just wanna make sure that it's the right direction. I guess that's not the right direction. There you go. So you'll be able to tell, it'll just sit there nice and flush. Because I've forgotten that so many times, and sometimes I still do. So you wanna make sure if your DS Lite does have this little piece, just lay it down. If you forget it, it's honestly not the biggest deal. I think it just adds a little bit of support for the stylus sheath. I mean, not really. I'm not really sure what that piece is for, but some DS Lites have it and some don't. So just, if yours does have it, make sure you put that in before putting in the stylus sheath, because it'll just be kind of frustrating to have to take it all the way back apart once you find that piece sitting around somewhere. All right, so all the screws that are in this bottom shell piece, they are the gold screws. All the gold screws are the same length, so you don't have to worry about mixing them up. But yeah, so gold screws, you got the 3 that are going in here. And then you want to make sure that the metal shield is facing the right direction. It can be a little bit confusing at first, but it should be, so that if it does have this little foam piece, sometimes it'll fall off. This little foam piece is going to be actually facing you when you're putting this back together. So you just got these little tabs here. So you should have the square tabs on top and the round on the bottom. And then if it does have that little this little foam piece, that should be facing up. But just to show you from an angle too, so that you know you're putting it in the right way, it should be this direction where this little circle piece has the part facing downwards. So it's kind of like, you see it's hooked in a little L shape. So you want it to be facing this direction when you put it down. And it should be under these little plastic notches here. There you go. Now that that piece is in place, more gold screws. It'll just be 2 more. These are all pH 0s. I'll go over in the beginning. I'll have to splice in some footage talking about the right tools that are needed for both the disassembly and reassembly. Anyways, put the 2 screws back. There we go. And now we're going to put in the volume slider and the power slider. So let's see, I want to make sure it's facing the right direction. We got the lower volume on the left and the higher volume on the right. So you want to make sure your volume slider is facing the same direction. You can see the smaller bar is on the left and the higher bar is on the right. So yep, that matches up. And you'll just kind of have to get a feel for this. There's not like a proper way to put this in, but you just kind of just hold it and just slot it in. And just kind of try to line it up. You might need to put it at a slight angle when putting it back in so that it'll pop in there nicely. Oh my gosh. Okay, there we go. So yeah, it might just take a little bit of wiggling and a little bit of practice, but yeah, I can't really think of a way to describe it where it's easy to put it in, but just try to make sure it's lined up and then facing the right direction, and then it should be fine. All right, and so you want to be careful when you have this piece apart like this anyways, to make sure that that volume slider doesn't fall out somewhere, because it doesn't really have a notch holding it in place like the power slider does, so it's easier to fall out, so just keep an eye on that. And this one, I'll try to show how I put this in here. So there's a little notch that you can see right here, this little notch right there. Oh, get the camera to focus. And that little notch right there is what's going to be holding down this piece. So I want to make sure this is also facing the right direction. You see a little arrow pointing upwards like that. Make sure that's facing this way on the console. So facing upwards, pointing this way. That's how you know it's in the right direction. And then you're going to want to put it, I usually try to have it at a little bit of an angle when sliding it in. And you want to make sure the bottom is in that little nook down there that I showed you, that little notch. That's what's going to be holding it in place. So you want to make sure it's inside of that and it's at a little bit of an angle, and then you just want to put a little bit of pressure and push it in. And now the slider is held in place. You can see it's being held down in that little slot right there. And some of these will be easier than others. Sometimes that notch is looser for whatever reason, or sometimes the pieces just slide in and out easier or more difficult. So just, patience with whatever you're feeling. If it has more tension, you might need to put a little bit more force when putting it back, but just make sure it's lined up first so that you're not breaking anything. Because I have broken that little notch down there. I've broken it off before. It's not the end of the world. The motherboard will still hold it in place. It's just that now this piece will fall out easier. So now when putting this bottom piece back on, we're gonna get this motherboard back here. And let's see, double check that all the screws are in there. Everything is screwed down, not forgetting anything. Sliders are both in. So what I like to do is make sure the volume is all the way one direction. I usually just have it all the way to the right, and then make sure the volume slider is down, because I've done this so many times where I put it in and I have the volume or the power slider up, and then it'll still fit down here perfectly, but now you won't be able to turn on your console because the slider is not lined up with this notch here, like the little nub right here for the power switch. It's supposed to fit into these two little slots here for the power slider. So that's supposed to be lined up. But anyways, so yeah, I try to make sure that the slider for the volume is all the way to the right. And then I make sure that I push down on the slider when I put it back, just to make sure that it's the right direction. Make sure the volume slider is all the way to the right as well, so that everything's lined up. And then just kind of put it down, and it should just kind of fall into place, you know? As long as everything's lined up, you can just push down on it. Everything should clip back together properly. Double check before screwing everything in. Yep, the volume slider is down. I mean, the power slider is down like it's supposed to be. So that way you can still push on it and still turn it on. And then the volume slider, you can double check as well. Yep, it's lined up properly. Everything's slid in. And that's good. If something is not lined up right, one of the cables, one of the antenna wires or anything, you will be able to feel some pressure springing back from this plastic piece. And if you do feel that, you might want to, you know, maybe just pop it back off really quick, double check that everything is, you know, wired and laid down properly, just so that way when you put the plastic back on, it should be nice and flush, and you shouldn't really feel too much resistance pushing back up on it. Like, yeah, this piece here should be lined up. These two pieces of plastic here and here, they should be pretty flush and not springing back at you. So that's just kind of a way to double check that everything has been put back together properly. Now we are going to put the rest of the screws back in. So we'll start with the tri-wings. There's one here, here, and here. So we're gonna use the Y0, and the silver tri-wings are all the same length. So there's one here. And then the last tri-wing screw is going to be the black tri-wing screw. It's a little bit smaller. And then that screw goes right here where the cartridge slot is. And I have dropped that into the cartridge slot before, but no worries, you can just turn it upside down and dump it back out if that happens. Anyway, so there we go. The last tri-wing screw goes right there. And then we're gonna change the bit for the screwdriver back to the PH0, put the rest of the Phillips screws back. And so you got the two gold screws. These go under the screw covers right here. So the gold screws go here and here, the two gold Phillips ones. All right, the second gold screw. And then the last silver Phillips screw will go right here under the battery. And there we go. Everything's back together, and you can pop the battery in, and you can test out your console, see if everything's working. This motherboard is bad, but you know, if you wanted to do that before putting the battery cover back on and before screwing in, not screwing in, but before putting the screw covers back on over these slots here, you can do that as well. And you can do that, you know, because I should have mentioned it, I'll have to splice in some footage. You can also leave the screw covers off of here as well, so that you don't have to pry them back up, just in case something is wrong with that top screen once you turn it back on and have it tested all the way. But yeah, so once everything is good and you're ready to put it all the way back together, you can just pop the battery cover back on. And you know, these little notches here, just slide in right there and put it down that way. And you can just screw it in. And then you can place the two screw covers back on just like that. The round part of the screw cover will be facing up and the flat part facing down, just like the shape of the console. It'll line up. You put a little pressure on them. They usually stick down pretty easily unless the adhesive strip comes off. But if you feel like they're loose, you know, you can maybe add a little bit of Elmer's glue or something and stick it back on. But it's really up to you, or you can leave them off, whatever personal preference is. They're really also to help to make sure that the bottom of the console doesn't get scratched up as much. It'll just give it a little bit of extra space to rest on the table before like the plastic hits it. But yeah, that's really what those are meant for. So you just put a little bit of pressure to make sure that the adhesive sticks. And then you got the GBA cover. I guess I can show disassembling this too. You can also use a Y0 for this screw as well. So you can see the screw for the GBA cover is in my hand right here, and that one is it is rounder than the screw for the console. You have them next to each other. They look to be about the same length, but if you get them mixed up, the screw for the GBA cover is much more round than the DS Lite. But it's just that one tri-wing screw, and then you should be able to slide the piece forward and then take it off. And then you can take out this little chip here. I guess it's to shield the pins or maybe clean the pins. I don't really know what this piece in here is for, but you know, this one's kind of stuck down, but usually it'll just fall out. But if you wanted to clean it, just get a little pry tool. But there we go. Okay, so you can take that all apart and clean it out if you need to. But now that that's back in, you just have it this way so that you have this piece. Yeah, it'll be this shape right here with the little slots, yeah, facing upwards. And then the pins will be facing upwards as well. You don't want to put it in backwards. It won't really sit in there properly if you try to. And then same thing, you're gonna need to have it offset because you're gonna need to slide it on just like the top shell. And then push it back together and then screw it back in. Whoops. Screw it back in with the very round screw that is used for that piece. And then the stylus. All right, now the DS Lite is put back together. I hope this video was helpful for you guys. I've been meaning to make these disassembly and reassembly videos for a long time. I just never got around to it, so I apologize for that because I know some people have been waiting on it. Anyways, I hope you guys found this video helpful. I try to be as detailed as possible. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you disliked it, hit the dislike button. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more content like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Anyways, thank you guys again so much for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you later, guys.